Most people assume Viking ships survived because of thick timber, cold climates, or brute force craftsmanship. That explanation is incomplete. Oak alone does not explain why some Scandinavian structures survived centuries of freezing rain, salt air, fungal decay, and constant moisture exposure, while later European wooden structures failed in a fraction of the time. The overlooked reality is that Viking builders understood something modern construction often ignores. Wood does not rot simply because it gets wet. It rots because moisture becomes trapped inside the fibers long enough for biological decay to take hold. That distinction shaped nearly every aspect of Norse construction. The Vikings built in some of the harshest environmental conditions in northern Europe. Their settlements faced freeze-thaw cycles, ocean spray, long winters, and persistent dampness. Yet archaeological excavations across Norway, Iceland, and parts of the British Isles continue to uncover preserved beams, boat fragments, roof supports, and carved timber that endured far longer than many later medieval structures. What modern audiences often miss is that Viking survival depended less on fighting the environment and more on understanding how to cooperate with it. Their ships, homes, and storage buildings were not designed to permanently repel water. They were designed to breathe, dry, flex, and recover. That approach became one of the foundations of northern maritime survival. The forgotten part of Viking woodworking was never just the carving of timber itself. Modern woodworking discussions tend to focus on tools, joinery, or species of wood. Viking builders certainly cared about those things, but preservation began much earlier, at the moment the tree was selected. Scandinavian woodcutters understood seasonal timing in ways that later industrial forestry largely abandoned. Trees cut during winter carried lower sap content. That mattered because excess internal moisture accelerated fungal activity after construction. In northern climates, where drying opportunities were limited, reducing internal water from the start increased the lifespan of beams and hull planks dramatically. The Vikings also favored slow-grown timber from colder regions. Dense growth rings created tighter grain structures, reducing the rate at which moisture penetrated the wood. This was especially important for ships exposed to saltwater expansion and contraction. A weak plank in the North Atlantic was not a maintenance inconvenience. It was a survival threat. Archaeological analysis of Viking ship remnants from sites like Oseberg Ship Burial and Gokstad Ship Burial shows consistent evidence of careful timber selection, controlled shaping, and preservation techniques designed to minimize long-term decay rather than merely improve appearance. This becomes important because many later European shipbuilders emphasized speed of production during wartime expansion. Viking societies, by contrast, often treated timber as a strategic resource that required years of planning before a vessel ever entered the water. The real protection came from controlled exposure, not complete sealing. One of the biggest misconceptions about ancient waterproofing is the belief that old societies simply coated wood in tar and solved the problem. Tar was important, but the Viking method worked because it combined coating with ventilation. Wood sealed too aggressively traps internal moisture. Once fungal organisms establish themselves beneath a surface layer, decay accelerates invisibly. Viking construction instead allowed structures to shed water quickly while still drying naturally between storms. Long houses were designed with airflow in mind. Elevated foundations reduced ground moisture transfer. Roof overhangs protected walls from constant runoff. Ships were frequently pulled ashore and dried intentionally. Maintenance itself became part of the preservation system. This practice reflected a broader survival philosophy found throughout Scandinavian maritime culture. No material remains durable without continual stewardship. That lesson influenced later northern naval traditions. Even centuries afterwards, Scandinavian and Baltic shipyards retained maintenance cycles that Mediterranean fleets often considered excessive. Yet those cycles extended operational lifespan significantly in cold water environments. The overlooked role of pine tar changed northern shipbuilding for centuries. Pine tar was one of the most strategically valuable materials in northern Europe for generations. Produced through slow-burning, resin-rich pine roots in oxygen-restricted pits, the substance penetrated wood fibers deeply while retaining flexibility after curing. That flexibility mattered enormously. Hard sealants crack under temperature stress. Once fractures form, water enters rapidly. Pine tar expanded and contracted alongside the timber itself. Viking shipbuilders understood this through experience long before chemistry explained it scientifically. Tar production became so important that Scandinavian economies later exported massive quantities throughout Europe. Naval powers depended on it during the Age of Sail. Without tar, fleets deteriorated rapidly, but even tar alone was not enough. Viking preservation relied equally on shaping techniques that reduced standing water accumulation. Hull planks were designed to channel runoff. Roof boards overlapped in ways that encouraged drainage instead of retention. Structural joints often avoided flat horizontal surfaces where moisture could settle. This is where, modern survival and bushcraft communities unknowingly rediscovered several Viking principles. When contemporary outdoorsmen split kindling, carve shelter supports, or prepare camp structures, they often encounter the same environmental reality. Poorly shaped wood fails quickly in wet climates. Sharp edges, for instance, absorb moisture faster. Improper grain exposure, it accelerates cracking. Weak splitting can damage structural integrity before rot even begins. A practical, modern equivalent of the compact field tools that Viking craftsmen depended on can be seen in something like the Purple Dragon camping hatchet axe with sheath, a hand-forged survival hatchet designed for chopping, splitting, and carving under outdoor conditions. Tools of this type really reflect an older principle that Viking woodworkers understood clearly. Preserving timber starts with how the material is processed in the field, long before it becomes part of a structure. The Viking relationship with wood was, honestly, inseparable from survival logistics. In modern societies, wood is often treated as disposable because industrial supply chains replace damaged materials easily. Viking societies, though, operated under entirely different constraints. A failed beam during winter could threaten an entire household. A damaged ship plank could delay trade, weaken regional alliances, or even leave crews stranded. Timber preservation, therefore, became a logistical necessity tied directly to survival and political stability. This also explains why Viking expansion succeeded across such difficult environments. Their settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and parts of the North Atlantic required constant adaptation to resource scarcity. In Greenland especially, suitable timber was limited. Driftwood became valuable. Imported lumber carried strategic importance. Preservation was not simply economical, it was essential. The Norse colonies that survived longest were often those most capable of maintaining infrastructure efficiently under environmental stress. When maintenance systems collapsed, settlements weakened rapidly. Historians sometimes frame Viking decline primarily through military or religious transformation, but, environmental strain deserves equal attention. Resource management failures, changing climate conditions during the late medieval period, and increasing logistical pressure all contributed to weakening northern settlements over time. Wood preservation was therefore never an isolated craft. It actually sat at the center of Scandinavian endurance. Modern construction often repeats the same mistakes Viking builders learned to avoid. Many modern wood failures emerge from prioritizing speed, appearance, or cost over environmental adaptation. Pressure-treated lumber resists some forms of decay, but poor ventilation still destroys structures surprisingly fast. The Vikings would likely recognize many contemporary failures immediately. Decks positioned too close to soil retain moisture constantly. Sealed surfaces without airflow develop hidden rot beneath coatings. Flat architectural designs collect standing water. Fast-growth timber absorbs moisture differently than dense, old-growth wood. Ironically, some traditional Scandinavian building methods now outperform certain modern practices precisely because they evolved through centuries of environmental correction. This is particularly visible in surviving stave churches across Norway. Structures such as Borgund Stave Church demonstrate how ventilation gaps, elevated foundations, tar treatment, and flexible joinery extended structural lifespan across centuries of severe climate exposure. These buildings were not preserved accidentally. They represent accumulated practical knowledge refined through repeated observation. The deeper lesson was never really about wood at all. What makes Viking preservation methods historically important is not merely that they worked. Many ancient techniques worked temporarily. The Viking approach mattered because it reflected a larger understanding of resilience. They accepted maintenance as permanent. They designed systems expecting environmental stress. They built for repairability rather than permanence alone. And they understood that survival in harsh climates depended more on adaptation than resistance. That philosophy extended beyond ships and buildings into navigation, agriculture, clothing, and winter preparation. The societies that endured longest were usually those most willing to work with environmental realities instead of pretending technology alone could eliminate them. Modern audiences sometimes romanticize Viking culture as purely aggressive or expansionist. In reality, much of Scandinavian survival depended on patience, maintenance discipline, and material understanding developed over generations of hard environmental experience. That may be the most overlooked lesson of all. Understanding these forgotten systems matters because they reveal how historical societies solved problems modern cultures still struggle with today: sustainability, material durability, climate adaptation, and long-term resilience under environmental pressure. The Vikings did not preserve wood through mystery or myth. They preserved it through observation, discipline, and accumulated practical knowledge passed from one generation to the next. And in many ways, that knowledge remains relevant far beyond archaeology. If you enjoyed this deep dive into overlooked historical survival knowledge, subscribe to History Vault for more documentaries exploring the forgotten systems, strategies, and realities that shaped the past, and share this video with someone who still thinks ancient builders survived on strength alone.